or when we met earlier this year, you shared about, for example, an innovative spin on DAOs, which you recommended be considered for governance of a structure like this. And so I was wondering if you could please explain this concept and why you think it would be fitting for us.
Sure. So I actually posted on this, but it's the ABCs of DAOs. And so let's call there three kinds of DAOs. The truly autonomous DAO, the bureaucratic DAO, and the CEO DAO. Okay. So those are the A, the B, and the C. Autonomous, bureaucratic, CEO. And autonomous is what the initial vision of a DAO was. And, maybe something like Augur 2.0, where they literally threw away the key. A genuinely, totally debugged, working, game theory stable protocol where you never need to make any updates to it, and you can throw away the admin keys. That's like truly autonomous. Relatively few things hit that level. I think, even arguably, I mean, do Bitcoin and Ethereum hit that level? Arguably they do, because they're only having maintenance by developers. But relatively few things hit that level of A. Then B, the bureaucratic DAO, the reason that's an important thing to at least conceptualize is it's not really a digital autonomous organization. It's really more of like a crypto community. And often governance, there's platforms like snapshot.org and they're pretty good. And Votagora, which I'm an investor in, and they're good. What I find sometimes is that some of these communities are bureaucratic DAOs where they make a fetish out of just a committee meeting on everything and a direct vote on this and a direct vote on that. But really, you don't want to have constant politics and a campaign for every single feature request and pull request. You should, that's the whole point of representative democracy. You have like a feedback mechanism where the people or the shareholders or what have you have their say, and then somebody is empowered with local information to make decisions. And then there's like you return and you evaluate them every period of time. The time constants matter. Like, do you do that every month or do you do that every few years or what have you? But that's a concept. So I think the bureaucratic DAO is often a bad place to be because you have all these conflicts. For example, somebody can vote themselves the money out of the DAO treasury and all that kind of stuff. And those are all exacerbated when these are all, people on the internet who haven't met each other before. And the only thing they're there for is to, have this project that suddenly has a pot of money. All of that stuff, you've seen tons of that kind of drama over the last few years. And the third model is the CEO DAO, where it's basically minimum necessary governance. You have a CEO who the DAOs, the DAO coin holders or NFT holders or what have you, however you want to define them, have a on-chain plebiscite that gives that person power over the treasury and the DAO for some term of 4 years or 6 years or whatever it is, right? Or, they have some term limit. And all of those parameters are things you can pick, but obviously there's a rich history for going back many years of people thinking about this. It's very similar to all the thinking that people had about what the optimal monetary policy should be. And now people could try demurrage monetary policy. All these crazy things where you had to be a central banker to try can now be tried. In the same way, lots of these types of things. Do you want a parliamentary system? Do you want a presidential system? Blah, blah. But the point is to actually start having governance in that way, right? And I think the CEO DAO is probably one of the best ways to go because you have a very clear individual who's accountable and they can appoint who they want, and then they've got a term and it expires and they get reelected or not, and or they've got term limits. And so those are three models: the autonomous, which is truly an algorithm, the bureaucratic, and the CEO. And the crucial concept, by the way, is in the autonomous case, there's no leaders. In the CEO case, there's one leader. In the bureaucratic case, there's N leaders, and N is very ill-defined and miasmic, and it can appear to be the autonomous case, but actually it's like the worst option usually because a committee isn't as free as the autonomous case, but it's not as responsible as the CEO case. Let me pause there.
I was a big fan of the CEO DAO as soon as you told me about it. And we have a quite big mission here and want to live up to a protocol or a platform that can encompass many of these DAOs uh, of all three kinds, and many also traditional companies, and maybe also network states all together. We are totally focused on capture resistance in the first place. We need to stand our own ground, and from there on we can move forward. And yeah, my question would be, how can we make sure, if we want to be a platform that is actually capture resistant, that we have many layer twos that can be CEO DAOs, that can be autonomous DAOs, and so on, while not giving them any power to capture the layer one? And how can we design the layer one or identify the people that are fitting for this mission of creating a layer one, of really building it in a way that actually lives up to these standards? And if you overall think that this is a fruitful idea.
Yeah. So do you mean specifically the L1 of Ethereum, or do you mean an L1 in general?
An L1 in the sense of this ZuVillage here is like
Oh, I see.
the network state conference. Here we discuss ideas and promote the idea, but we want to come up with a protocol system with a clear rule work, or with a clear concept work, with modules that basically see the individual mind of the cognitive sovereign individual as atomic unit, opt into that in informed consent, and from there on have a trustless or trust minimizing system to build, so that we have the attention and the resources to establish risk assessed trust wherever we need to, but outsource all possible trust to the system and to Web3 solutions when we can. And we also are very huge about privacy and about not being captured or surveilled by, let's say, geopolitical players.
Sure.
Without any specification.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Your location makes that clear. What, you know, who this might be.
Many.
But
actually, in a globalized world. No?
Sure. No, it's a global setting, of course. I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure that there's like, you know, so if I was to give advice on that, that would be theory, because we just haven't seen too many of these yet, right? But some initial comments would be that the community and the leadership will probably matter more than the technology, usually, because you just want to have a tight-knit community that believes in the leadership and the mission statement. And then you can implement, you know, crypto has advanced far enough now that, you know, if you want to implement a passport system, zero knowledge passport system, if you want to do low cost payments, and so like all of that stuff is now there. That wasn't true 5 years ago, probably not, arguably not even 3 years ago, 2 years ago. But now a lot of the primitives are there. And so I'd really start from the community and its purpose first. This is what I call in the Network State book, the one commandment. Actually, by the way, can I talk about that for a second? The one commandment, just for a second?
Like the protocol should be the one commandment, and we want to identify, as the protocol is done, the individuals that actually are putting skin in the game for that. So our approach, yeah. But please.
So I somewhat disagree on a protocol being a one commandment. Let me explain what I'm saying by this. You know, if you describe YouTube to somebody, you'd say, oh, it's a place that you can upload videos and watch videos. What's Twitter or X? It's okay, where you find out news. What's Dropbox? Okay, I can upload files and share files, and so on and so forth. Almost every major service has like a one-line description of what they're good for, uniquely good for. And each of these things has often secondary, tertiary, quaternary functions. Like, you know, for example, on Dropbox, it's also got like a Word document editor and other kinds of things there. And you can't pack all of that into one sentence. You necessarily need to summarize the thing with its distinguishing characteristic. And the same thing is true for any new community. You'll have to say, what is this community about in one sentence? And there will be 1,000x as many people who hear that one sentence as actually ever even poke into the community and hear the second sentence. It's like, you know, what is this new coin? What's Monero? It's a privacy coin. Okay. 1,000x as many people have heard that as have actually used Monero. So it's one commandment is privacy, right? And so in the same way, a new community, I don't think, with meaning zero offense, I don't think it can be, oh, it's a protocol, or oh, it's, you know, skin in the game, or something. It has to be something like, for example, the purpose of this community is to extend life. Life extension is good. Or the purpose of this community is to, I don't know, learn Turkish. It's like Turkish immersion. Okay. Or, you know, the purpose of this community is like, you know, religious Catholic education, or the purpose of this community is to reconstitute what the 1950s were like with the dress and clothing and all of that, or whatever it is, right? There's, once you start thinking in this way, there's thousands of different possible communities that have purposes there. And you essentially, you have that one commandment, not because it's the only thing the community is doing, but because your initial community has to have a focus, it has to have a raison d'etre, it has to have a purpose. And that purpose is not a technological purpose, it's often a moral purpose, because when pushed, someone will say, well, why should that thing exist? You know, like as an example, let's say it's the life extension community. That's a very easy one for us, because it's like, why should that exist? Well, death is bad, but most people don't think death is bad enough. They're not working hard on stopping death. So we're going to build a community around that, and you can build a whole thing, moral architecture around that, and that's something that's strong enough to attract funding and attract people and whatnot. And then so the community, the premise comes first, the one commandment, and then the community comes second, the technology comes third.
I agree with you. I think that what you talk about is the archetype of what I picture as the layer 2. The
Okay.
platform itself
I see.
can encompass thousands of these communities that, to a huge part, if they are not just autonomous DAOs or so, should have one commandment in order to get something done. But even there, with a platform that would also be refinanceable by communities that are.
So what is a platform in your context? Is it ZuVillage?
It could be. It could be. I mean, this year.
But can you give me a specific example of, because
an interoperable set of either technological or cultural norms that make these communities interconnectable and produce a network effect, and can, so to say, treat them as sovereign entities while not being captured by them, while still enabling the links between them.
I understand what you're saying, but let me argue that the specific always precedes the general. You almost never start with the abstraction, you start with the concrete. Let me give a few examples from history. So every major a login service, Facebook login, Google login, Twitter login, LinkedIn login, right? Microsoft login, all of those started with some incredibly popular and viral product like Facebook itself. And so hundreds of millions of people signed up to Facebook. And then they had a large enough group of people for that product that they could turn it into a platform. And they made Facebook platform. Or you have hundreds of millions of people sign up for Google because they wanted to use Gmail. And then that turned into Google Login, and that, you know, login could be reused for that and for Google Docs and for other things. Or you have hundreds of millions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars in value accrue to Ethereum, and then you could get ENS out of that. And that's been a long build over like 7 years. Now there's several million people with ENS accounts, but without that huge initial energy on the product, it was very difficult to get the naming system or whatever out of it. And I think that's just true as a general rule. If you think about math, you know, the general theorems come out of lots of concrete examples, and then you generalize from them, and then you can apply them, and they're powerful. But you didn't start with, I don't know, You didn't start with Euler's formula. People started with, the compass, and they're, looking at circles, and then, there's a lot of things that led up to that generalization. It didn't just, the right generalization doesn't just appear from thinking about it. It comes out of, essentially doing a bunch of things, specific things, and then abstracting it out. Let me pause there.
So Bitcoin started with the product and with the technology, or with the huge community that bought it?
So it's a great question. So Bitcoin, so first is there was hash cash, right? There were many things that led up to Bitcoin. There are digital signatures. All of those were specific, concrete, individual milestones that then were packaged together. And then the initial purpose of Bitcoin was, for the first several years, essentially the reaction against the financial crisis. And it had a very concrete kind of thing where lots of gold bug libertarians on message boards bought it for that purpose. And the smart contracts were turned off. And, Satoshi initially even had like a poker client associated with it that was turned off. And then eventually people realized, oh, okay, now that we need to put a price on this thing. And then the crypto exchange happened. And really the function of Bitcoin, in a sense, for the last whatever number of years, has been store of value number go up, right? It's not really digital cash. It's arguably focused more and more in that sense. It's not a platform. It's an inspiration for other platforms, but you had to have first, and by the way, you had to have first PayPal before you had Bitcoin, and you had to have Bitcoin before you had Ethereum. Ethereum could take a lot of the concepts from Bitcoin and say, okay, what if we did Bitcoin, but we enabled smart contracts, right? So the specific led to the next step. You could never have done Ethereum by itself, in my view, without the example of Bitcoin. You couldn't have done Bitcoin without the example of PayPal. You couldn't have done PayPal without the example of Visa and other things before it. Let me pause there.
No, I totally get your idea. When I picture communities as already existing target groups to market to, and I think that way I can really good integrate it. Thanks for your conciliation.
Awesome, cool. By the way, I'm supportive of everything you're saying. I'm just I'm trying to figure out how to slice it in the right way. That's all.
Even more happy to hear that.
Great.
Yeah, so I want to talk about like how I view protocolization or protocols versus DAOs.
Sure.
I've worked in for years, and I'm sure you know compound finance from DeFi. So
Yeah.
I usually use them as my example of how a community can like go from a protocol or from a DAO that uses the protocol to being like more protocolized and allowing these multiplicities of communities to enact. So you might know Rari Finance, which then took the compound protocol, and then instead of having like one DAO that controlled this one market, they then allowed anyone to create their own market, and then you had this marketplace of different kind of like capital allocators or risk managers that were controlling their own lending markets. And so I think that's kind of like a good model potentially for these pop-up cities to kind of replicate, like having kind of like what is a pop-up city and like protocolizing a pop-up city, but then having different governance models of like what is a track or like what types of tracks are there and what are the community rules that are going on. But I think currently the issue that's maybe facing ZuVillage in terms of making the protocol is that there isn't a good like n=1 of like a pop-up city that works, that we can actually replicate and that like went smoothly all the way through, that everyone was like actually happy with how it went. So yeah, maybe
I thought
like,
Vitalia was pretty good. I thought Vitalia was pretty good. I thought the first Zulu was pretty good. I thought Edge Esmeralda that just went off was pretty good. But
different in different ways, and people definitely had different problems with them, and they're all different from
Sure.
each other. We still have to figure out, what works in terms of like a pop-up city, and just like the definition of like size and scale, and how many people actually need to live there like full time, and transportation. So like Esmeralda and Vitalia were both kind of like very spread out and far apart in terms of like housing. And that was a complaint. So it's like, do people want to have a pop-up city where it's like all walkable distances?
Mhm.
And I don't know if Vitalia kind of fell into that. I was at Vitalia, for example, for like 2 months, so I know what you're talking about. I did really very much enjoy it.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm sorry. What was your question exactly? What should I react to there?
My original question was like, is there an example of a pop-up city that like really worked that we can start to, or maybe not a pop-up city, but a network state that we can use as an example to protocolize?
Well, so yeah, I think those three have been the best so far. Zizulu, the one in Montenegro, Vitalia in Prospera, and Edge Esmeralda. I think those are the three so far. One can critique them, but they did have hundreds of people come there. People paid. People, I think, generally liked it in terms of NPS. certainly ZuVillage is inspired by that. So I'd say those are the three best ones right now.
And like what aspects of them would you say like were worked and like should be replicated or protocolized versus things that could be like more DAOified or like community-based decisions?
I am averse to the phrase protocolized. Replicate is good, but the reason I don't love the phrase protocolized is it's like jumping to a very systematized thing on something that you basically have to do something manually many times before you automate it. Like it took a long time for example, Google, for Facebook to come up with protobufs, if you know what that is. And it's because they basically just kind of hack together ways for their data centers to communicate and their programs to communicate, and then eventually they abstracted out protobufs. So I would not really say to protocolize something for a while. That's like a very high standard of something is working and we want to systematize what's working. You need to edit things a lot before you protocolize, in my view. With that said, what I think is great about those three things, the single most important is they had community leaders who took financial risk in getting the real estate and got people to come there. And they basically organized the party. The degree to which the network state is about real estate is not appreciated. There's a lot of real estate in the network state. You know what it is? You know the analogy? It's like the degree to which cryptocurrency is about fiat banking is the degree to which the network state is about real estate. It's like a necessary evil that also actually enables a lot of the real value, because what is crypto about? Well, a big part of it is, it's about applications, about all that stuff. I agree with all that stuff. But for the outside world, what is showing the success of it is the price. And that interface between the cloud and the land is everything. And that comes from the banking interface. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to get the BTC USD or ETH USD quote. In the same way, the interface between the network state and real estate is the interface between the cloud and the land in community space, not currency space, right? And having somebody use their US passport or EU passport, and then they get their ZuVillage passport, that's similar to the BTC USD exchange rate, right? And the issuance of digital passports and the creation, the reconceptualization of citizenship as membership, what that all really, I shouldn't say requires, because you can do a lot of it online, but I think the thing that feels the most real and the thing that we should push on and we should go from 3 to 10 to 100 are the physical pop-ups. Like what you guys are doing is wonderful. Like I'm sure Veronica will agree. There's a lot of logistics associated with getting all of you guys into a room. Much harder than it looks.
Yeah, cool. I would love to talk about real estate and everything.
Is Veronica there? Is Veronica smiling about that? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. We're all clapping for her. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But there's a line getting, but I would love.
Yeah. Go. Keep going. Yeah. Thanks. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, Balaji. I really enjoyed your MOOC way back in 2013.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, and I still use your dot files in my robots.
Oh, wow. Great.
Yeah. So my question is, initially, I started out thinking about the legal engineering track here last week. That, well, definitely governance as a service. Eric Brimman talks about that, but that we could take the Roatan common law code, which is Tom Bow's ULEX kernel, and think about what could be applied to a Zoo network state and for commerce between the nodes, all that. But as we were delving into it and chatting with Nick Anzinger, he was one of our guests. He just quickly said, "Hey, you don't actually have any sovereignty in Georgia, so what are you going to apply of the code?" And so that's definitely a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so what I realized though is a lot of governance as a service, Ethereum already does. It's a settlement layer. So I'm wondering what parts of the Roatan commercial code or common law code or ULEX in general do you think are also available for national agnosticism for governance as a service? If there's any kind of frameworks you can think of so we can start to hack away and move things into solidity more than just currency and lending and escrow.
Totally.
Yeah. If you have any
Great
thoughts.
question. So I have a talk coming out on this called Techno-Democracy, but let me sketch some concepts from it. The first is democracy is about the denominator. What I mean by that is you have a vote and it's like, okay, it's 37%, let's say 57% of people, but 57 out of 100, who's the denominator? What is the set of people over which the vote is taken? And right now, we take for granted that that's a geographically delimited set. It's all the people who are in the USA, all the people who are in the UK, all the people who are in Georgia or Italy or what have you, right? That roughly geographical set is the denominator. And then you'll qualify, then you'll say, okay, well, I might be a citizen, but I'm overseas or what have you, right? There, but still, the implicit premise is that the vast majority of citizens are within some physical location, right? That's the whole nation state concept. But you can contest that. And you can say, well, think about Ethereum, you're thinking about Bitcoin, that's starting cloud first, land last. And the denominator for a DAO vote are all the coin holders worldwide who are in the same online community, but different physical geography, right? So democracy is about the denominator. The meta upstream of it before the vote happens is your choice of what set you belong to, right? And so you actually rethink of citizenship from first principles of like, what set do I want to be a member of, right? And I think this is going to become a much, 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 much bigger thing than people realize. I don't know how to say this without like sounding doomer-ish or whatever, but okay, so you guys are literally physically in Georgia now. Now, maybe just show of hands, maybe you can ask this question, but show of hands, okay? How many people know about all the post-Soviet conflicts after the USSR broke down? Like what fraction of the room is raising their hands? Like what, 50%?
Like 70 to 80%.
Oh, 78%. Okay. Maybe it's because people in this side of the world know that when the Soviet Union broke down, people no longer had the identity of Soviet citizen, something that had been around for almost 70 years, and that there'd been so much propaganda behind. 289 million people had to find a new identity, right? And that's like their currency getting devalued. Their identity got devalued, right? Their papers got devalued. The thing that they had fought for, the Soviet Union, oh my God, the Great Patriotic War, all this crazy stuff, all the sacrifice for decades and decades, decades, gone, right? And so now they had to say, okay, am I a Russian? Is that, so lots of people went back to blood. Very understandable. Am I a Russian? Am I an Estonian? Am I Yugoslavian? Wait a second. Yugoslavia, then broke into a bunch of things. Am I Czechoslovakian? Well, actually, maybe I'm Czech and I'm Slovakian. There's a velvet divorce. All right, Tajikistani, what is a Tajikistani even, right? The Tajikistani civil war kicks off like 100,000 people dead, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the Russia-Ukraine thing is actually, in a sense, fallout from that breakdown over what is the set of people, right? Like who is in this set, who is governing me, and so on and so forth. And in my view, that's actually just a preview of what's to come on the Anglo side of the world. I think we're going to have something similar to a USSR breakdown. I think an even larger number of people are going to need to find their new identity, not as American, but as Bitcoiner or, Texan or Christian or Jewish or Muslim or whatever it is, right? They're going to need to find some other identity, just like Soviet citizen didn't exist anymore. So that's like that's the driver of thinking deeply about what set you belong to. Now, to your question about like what can be done in terms of governance, you don't have sovereignty, obviously, over the land. What you can do is you can form a digital polity in the cloud. And the fundamental premise of democracy is consent of the governed. You go all the way back, you strip away all the superstructure or whatever, like Martin Luther, the 95 DC's hammers to the door of Whittington Church, right? He goes all the way back to the original documents, takes away all the Catholic Church's interpretations, like, okay, let me go to base layer, the original text. Let me see. Okay, consent of the governed. Okay. What that means is if you have a bunch of people and they all consent to be governed, they all opt into a cloud community, in what sense can someone say they're not a polity? If they're large enough, and they're smart enough, and they're strong enough, they have earned the right to self-determination. They just have to convince enough other people around them who are outside the set, but maybe friendly to them, that they are, this is what it means for a nation to get recognition, right? That's why, like, you know, for example, Taiwan is in like a boundary area where there's a big bad, you know, like China doesn't want them to get recognized, but lots of other countries realize that, right? So that's an interesting boundary case. Lots of other sets we just think of as, well, of course, everybody recognizes who an El Salvadoran is, right? That's not a controversial thing, right? What will be new, and what I think is going to be interesting, is build these digital polities, and just by their own recognizance, they can self-govern themselves on all digital things. Anything which is effectively a multisig, that's downstream of a multisig, can be governed by this digital polity that you've opted into. So obviously it's a treasury, but less obviously, it's, you know, I've got kind of 4 thresholds, right? You've got your Discord, you've got your DAO, you've got your doors, and you've got your drones. Okay. The Discord is just like your chat room. You can have an NFT gated chat room or what have you, and the issuance of the NFTs can be governed by the multisig. The DAO is the treasury, and then who gets the funds is governed by the multisig. The doors are if you have NFT door locks on your doors, or NFT locks on your cars, or NFT locks on any capital equipment, that too can be governed by the multisig. And then finally, the drones are the moving physical things, drones and humanoids, that can be governed by the multisig. Now you actually start to govern quite a lot with that multisig. You go from that opt-in online community to something that is able to do quite a lot in the physical world. That's the story of the next 10 years.
Great. All right, well, I'm going to pass it to other people. I would like to say Chance has done some work on enclaves for the non-contiguous.
Okay. Is this Chance taken?
Yeah.
Okay.
Look, Mennonite, history of Mennonites.
Cool. Thanks.
Hey, Balaji. I'm a space engineer, and thanks for explaining the difference between 3 types of DAOs. It's really helped. I've been part of a bureaucratic DAO for a while, and it's kind of yeah. So,
BDAO, the A DAO, B DAO, and C DAO. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, also your course on startup engineering was great. I didn't realize why you have to raise donations unless I started my own project. So the thing is that I'm doing open source software for space engineering, and I'm trying to figure out how to get to the point when it'll become DAO. The thing is that at this point in time, the software has to be developed. And as the founder, I have a vision how it could be done. So at this point in time, it doesn't make sense for me to follow, in a sense, to create a DAO, because, you know, I have a vision. But ultimately, it has to become a DAO. So any suggestions for a founder how to get to that point when you start when I create a project and like it's about fundraising. So how to get to the point when I have a vision to the point when there'll be a CEO DAO? So any suggestions?
Great question. So let's take your specific example of space, right? I don't know a huge amount about the space sector, but if I was tasked with what you're saying, I would first create a GitHub, or maybe even better nowadays, a Replit, because it's easier to just try out the code, that has whatever space software you're building, but I'd focus it on simulations and things that can be done on the computer, right? And I would very early on run it by, if you can, SpaceX engineers on Twitter, maybe Anduril guys, even though they're not doing space, they're doing aviation. There's quite a few people now who are doing space tech, right? I'm an investor in an Indian company called Agnikul and others, right? And I would just follow all those people on Twitter or X, and I would @mention them and say, is this cool? Is this cool? Early on, to make sure that, you're not doing something useless or whatever, right? like just making cool visualizations and getting the physics right for orbital calculations and an open source package. I don't know what open source stuff exists out there. Maybe that's already very basic. Maybe it's not. So I'd say the goal number one is get like 1,000-star GitHub repo, which you can do solo, okay? And get a bunch of engineers who are not, obviously don't go straight to Elon, who's super busy and has 5 million things going on, right? Don't go to Gwynne Shotwell. Go to your, basically busy, but online, SpaceX engineer, and you can just ping them and be like, is this cool, right? Once you've got like 1,000 fans for that GitHub, and that'll take, I don't know how long, I don't know how good you are programming or how far you are along. Now you have to ask yourself, why do you need a DAO? Well, you need financial resources to do something that you can't just do with your bare hands. And maybe that means you're actually building a rocket, or you're getting a launch site for community members or something like that. You're renting space in a satellite. I don't know exactly what it is, there, but that would be a good use of funds. And then, then you've got, your DAO also is probably a way for people to contribute to the development of the open source project. But essentially, I would start with something that is creating value and that has buy-in from a community. You're giving them something, quote, for free before you DAOify it.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for setting the threshold. Now we are 57 starts on GitHub. So yeah, maybe you need to get to the 1,000. Okay, let me pass.
I don't know if it's exactly 1,000. I'm just saying, if it's 1,000 stars, I would definitely invest in whatever it is you're doing. If there's 1,000 real stars.
Okay, yeah, 57 real stars. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Hi, Balaji.
Hello.
Christian from Vitalia. I wanted to run an idea by you that it feels to me that it's about time that we have a new Hanseatic League or a new Silk Road, essentially, this network of free communities. We have free jurisdictions now, such as Prospera. We have intentional communities. We have on-chain communities, such as the Suzalu ecosystem. However, many of them don't have either the physical location or are within existing network states. So it's this roundabout way of doing it, I was thinking, is perhaps getting a network of recognition of certificates of good standing in each of these places that would be recognized by the members of, say, this network. And with time, they could have enough weight to throw around and maybe, issue their own passports and, birth the broader networks.
Sure. I think there's definitely something to that. I think, however, before you can form a union of them, they each need to actually have something, right? Otherwise, you're just, you're unionizing a bunch of vaporware, right? So each of these things, for example, it took a while before the various colonies that were established in the US to become big enough to be worth unifying as a union, right? Like the early Roanoke colonies failed and so on and so forth. So, each of those different groups, I think, has to find their business model, and it has to work first, and they have to generate resources. It's like, Bitcoin has to work, and Ethereum has to work, and Solana has to work, and Coinbase has to work, and Kraken and Gemini and so on have to work. And then they can pool, obviously, the protocols themselves won't, but let's say large protocol holders, then they can pool their resources for legal defense against the SEC, for example, right? But each of those things had to kind of work on its own before the collective action would work.
Thank you.
So real pleasure to have you here. I
Hi.
came to the space through a study of constitutional design. And my first interest was the extent to which, a well-specified blockchain network, to me, can be understood as a form of constitutional ordering. It, constrains the incentives of the powerful validators to act on behalf of a broader class of users and creates an incentive-compatible equilibrium that acts to the benefit of both validators and users alike. And so ideally, your constitutional rules are self-executing, but as we well understand in, real-world constitutional contexts, they are far from self-executing, especially in terms of interpretive ambiguity, addressing uncertainty, changing circumstances, you name it. And so I found your ABCs of DAOs especially useful because it kind of disambiguates the criticism that was already emergent in communities of DAOs in name only. But I think that there are underappreciated elements of constitutional design that are emergent. And so to me, in addition to just, constraining the powerful or democratic voting, there's also the kind of canonical instantiation of, checking and balancing separate authorities within a particular constitutional structure. And I very much appreciated your characterization of, bureaucratic DAOs. And I would say, for me, bureaucratic has a very normative valence, which you kind of evoked with the term miasmic. That being said, DAOs like MakerDAO and, Yearn are actually creating sub-DAOs to exercise specific competencies within that broader ecosystem. And so one way of looking at that is just more bureaucratization, such as, bureaucracies within bureaucracies and competing with one another. But another way is to view it as kind of a form of constitutionally constrained, separated and balanced authorities. And my former RA works for MakerDAO, and so I have a particular lens on that ecosystem. But I would welcome your thoughts. Do you agree with that characterization? Is it just more bureaucracy, or is there the possibility for actually kind of separating and then therefore checking and balancing competencies within the DAO's organizational design?
Yeah. So, my understanding on this is that I know Maker had a founder, Rune, and I'm just forgetting Yearn's founder's name, but it was done initially by one guy, right? Who just set it up as a bunch of scripts for yield farming, and then it became a big thing. And so those started as CEO DAOs effectively, right? They had clear CEOs. And then what those CEOs essentially came up with teams, and they decentralized themselves, right? And in a sense, for example, this is the good version of bureaucracy, where you have a CEO and there's things they want to execute through an algorithm, and that's just pure computers. And there's other things they want to execute through an algorithm, but they require humans in the loop as well. Example, an assembly line, it's about both humans and machines, right? And a bureaucratic process at Amazon, for example, is the will of Bezos encoded in process at some level, right? If you track it back enough, it's probably Bezos or Bezos's delegate or Bezos's delegate's delegate that implemented that process, right? So now, of course, what can happen is over time, in the absence of that CEO, the bureaucracy has no check. It can do wrong things, because sometimes you set up, whenever you write code and you let it run, it'll do things that, oh, I didn't think of that edge case. And you're always debugging it and thinking of unexpected input and so on and so forth. And the same thing is true for a partially human algorithm, where there's humans who are executing parts of that, right? The inventor of that, the Bezos or the Rune or what have you, would say, oh, slaphead, I didn't mean it like that. Oh, no, you should do it this way or that way. Of course, the difference with humans in the loop versus a typical algorithm is that there can be potentially some kind of self-correction. But in general, you kind of want that CEO there who has not just the visibility, but the power to just totally edit the algorithm and so on, right? So, I would look at those as teams rather than bureaucracies, because they're ultimately probably indirectly appointed by a CEO. And often they'll continue to function for some time after the CEO is gone. But often, eventually, they sort of unhook from reality somehow. There's some assumption that breaks in the world around them. They're no longer producing the right results, but they're also unable to self-correct. And that's how bureaucracy drifts.
No, that's helpful. And the persistence of leadership is fascinating in its own right. Your reference to assembly lines, I think you might enjoy the history of Toyota outperforming US automotive manufacturers.
The Kaizen thing?
Well, it's attributed, yeah, I think so. It's attributed to the ability of workers themselves to shut down the assembly line.
Oh, yeah.
Created a level of trust and harnessing of local knowledge that led to Toyota doing far better than other assembly line automotive manufacturers. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, Balaji. It's great to meet you. I'm Fariza. I want to ask you if I want to build a specific culture in DAO in terms of structure, in terms of practices, in terms of like people with specific set of values, and I want to make it like last long. What do I do? Like, is there any like, and is there any difference like how do I do it is in a Web2 company and in this DAO? Like, is there any frameworks, maybe like, I don't know, books you can recommend, anything like comes
To make something last long,
yeah, like specific
like a community?
specific values, specific practices, if you want
Ah.
like build this culture and maintain it, like keep it in that way.
Well, I think that's hard to teach. I would say basically there's kind of, to oversimplify, I think there's two options. Either A, you're sort of like a born quasi-religious leader, like Joseph Smith of Mormonism, or Marx or Lenin, or a political leader, or like a really charismatic internet influencer. And then you just naturally can build movements and so on and so forth. So that's sort of like one approach. Or the second approach is you take something that's already been around for a long time. Example, Russian Orthodoxy. Example, traditional Chinese culture. Example, the Upanishads in India or something like that, right? And then you dust off that thing that had a lot of appeal, and then you essentially bring it to that culture, and you do the modern version of it. And that, of course, works better if you're part of that multi-thousand-year-old culture. It's easier if you're, I don't know, if you're Indian and talking about the Upanishads, it'll probably be easier for you to build a community around that. So those are my two thoughts. Otherwise, it's hard to make something last a long time. It's kind of like everything is set against that. Think about how hard it is to, like, I mean, here's a small example. I mean, it's a small example, an important example. The attempted assassination of Trump was a few weeks ago. Huge thing. And yet it's like 20 news cycles ago. It's like almost like out of people's memory banks at this point, right? So it's very hard to make people remember something for a long time unless there's a strong incentive and a community and so on and so forth around it.
Yeah, and especially if you have like your target audience, like the people that bear all this type of culture is like very small group, but you want like more people to have this type of culture, like to adopt it. Like
I think you'd really want to start with your purpose, and then you'd bake that into longevity. And I mean, how many things have been around 1,000 years? There's like Indian culture, Chinese culture, the Persians somewhat, right? Though they've had a lot of upheaval and what have you. It's not as Zoroastrian as it was. I mean, go ahead.
They're not like the target ones. Like there's like older cultures, like more centralized, less freedom, less openness, and so on. If you want to like build something new that that specific like companies and people have, but there are very few of them. Like, and you want to like build that kind of like a more open, more decentralized, more like with sense.
Sure, but I mean, I understand what you're saying, but the thing is, the more open something is, the less sense of a self it has, right? Like in the sense that the more open it is, then anything can be part of the set. And so the set can be diluted down. And so then is that going to be something that's recognizable in 100 years or something like that, right? There is a tension between, having something be, it's like, if you look at a cell, for example, right, under the microscope, you can tell if like an animal has passed away. It's like obvious, but how do you know if a cell is dead? Well, if its border is busted, that's to say, if its cell membrane is open, if it's at dynamic equilibrium with its surroundings, if its guts are out in the water and the water is in its guts, if it's open in that sense, it doesn't exist. It's no longer replicating. It doesn't have a long life, right? So there's like being fully open. Now, the counter argument to this is you can go so open that you're open source and you're replicated by everybody and you don't die because of that, right? You're just installed on a million computers, you're installed in a billion brains and so on and so forth. But then that has to actually have a cohesion and closedness all its own, because the same copy has to be replicated in all those places. Otherwise, what did you replicate, right? So you almost never get away from the idea of having to have something distinct that is protected and closed, you know, so.
Thanks.
Hi, Balaji.
Hello.
This is Nico Gallardo. We exchanged a couple messages on Firecaster.
Oh, great.
Just wanted to ask you about something that I feel is not talked about enough.
Are you GIU? No, Julie, are you?
No, Nico Gallardo. My
Okay, Nico. Okay. Sorry. I was trying to match it to the username. Keep going. I'm listening.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about like the self-sustainability and funding of network states. Well, I think at the beginning, maybe like a more investment VC model could work, but I feel in the longer term, like how do you fund the commons of the network state? I guess initially the digital ones and eventually the physical ones, and how do you think of self-sustaining these things?
I'm, practice, theory follows practice, right? Like, do you know how they came up with the science of thermodynamics?
No.
They just invented engines. And as they invented engines, the engineering came first and the science came second, right? And they had to figure it out to make better engines, right? That's what something like this is going to be like. Let's build the first network state unicorn, and then the next step will be clear.
Hey, so
Hello.
I have a problem that I noticed with network states and network state adjacent projects. So there is a quite significant amount of incest between all these projects. So for example, Praxis, Prospera, Liberland, Vitalia, Zuzalo, but not enough. So the ironic part—
Sorry, you say there's quite a lot of overlap? Is that the word you use? I couldn't hear that word.
incest. So the same people that
Oh,
are in one project are also to an extent involved with others. But my point is, it's in my view not enough. So all these network states don't actually network between themselves. So the ironic thing is that there are many projects that individually try to negotiate some concessions from the government, but none of them are big enough to throw their weight around, even though collectively they would be. So for example, most people don't really care which network state project succeeds. Most people in this ideology community would just flock to the first one that does. But there is no way for example Praxis or Liberland to say, okay, we have 1 million members actually, and not just our own internal members, right? We don't even have connected markets or stuff like that. So even the projects that are aimed at connecting them are there are multiple of them, and they don't cooperate effectively. So this is the biggest problem I see in this space.
I don't think it's, I understand what you're saying. So first is come to the Network State Conference in Singapore on September 22nd and stay tuned because I've got some big announcements coming the next day or so. So I have some things that may partially address what you're saying. With that said, I don't think it's the biggest problem yet. And the reason I don't is what you're saying is like the biggest problem with social media is the lack of interoperability. Like your accounts can't be ported back and forth and so on and so forth. In 2024 or even 2014, that you could make that argument because those networks had got into hundreds of millions or billions of users by that time. In 2004, you couldn't make that argument. those networks just simply weren't at scale, right? And so you're connecting a lot of things that just don't have enough mass to be interesting to connect. They need to work on their own, you know? And so my view is let them, you can't systematize, protocolize, connect, unionize, et cetera, stuff that doesn't exist yet and have traction on its own. Get traction first, do it yourself, have one CEO leader and make hard decisions and allocate resources and get to 1,000 in-person people, 10,000, and then everything will be clear. You'll have a bunch of people copy that, they'll network together, and you can figure out how you're cooperating, collaborating from that point. That's my view. Otherwise, what you're doing is, do you know the concept of a startup to startup deal? Oh, did you freeze? Oh, so there's startups and big companies, to simplify, right? And sometimes two startups come to me or something and they say, oh, I should do a deal with this other startup. And I say, no, you shouldn't. With a very few exceptions, like when it's an API that one startup is using of another startup's, with very few exceptions like that, startups should not do deals with other startups because neither of them have any resources. They don't have money. They don't have time. They don't have a debug product. They don't have lots of users. They don't have lots of brand reputation. They don't have anything, usually, right? They're very early. It's like doing a business deal between two babies, like a big company or a big entity can do a deal with a startup. Yes, that can work, right? Or a startup can do a bunch of smaller deals with customers, become bigger, and once it's mezzanine, it can do something with another company. But in general, you just kind of have to make it work yourself before you can do all the alliances and meta stuff and so on and so forth.
I don't necessarily see the logic of it, but the fact that you
Thanks.
Hi, Balaji. Good to see you again.
Hello.
I was thinking about the CEO DAO. So how do we avoid going back to the centralization top-down approach when it's a DAO that wants to be decentralized, basically?
So in the Network State book, I actually talked about the least popular and most important word in the world, re-centralization. Okay. Why is that the least popular and most important word? Because there's centralization, decentralization, re-centralization. And re-centralization is unpopular for both the centralization and decentralization people. Why? Well, the centralization people say, well, why do you need a new boss? We've got the current thing. And the decentralization people say, why do you need a boss at all? Or do you need a center or a hub or whatever? We're all about decentralization. And my view is decentralization is a tool, and there'll be phases where you decentralize and phases where you re-centralize. And those go in a sinusoidal fashion. You centralize, decentralize, re-centralize, re-decentralize, back and forth like this. And it's not just cyclical, it's like helical. And I talk about this in the Network State book, but let me explain what I mean by that. So you have, for example, CDs, and they have all these songs in them. And then you decentralize that into lots of individual songs. And then you re-centralize that into playlists and you share them. Okay. Or you have newspapers and they have all these articles, and you decentralize that into a bunch of individual URLs. And then you re-centralize that into social media feeds of people that you follow. Okay. And this is bundling, unbundling, and rebundling. In Chinese history, it's like, the empire, long united must divide, long divided must unite. And progress is helical. You have this cyclical aspect where it's, decentralization, centralization, but you also have like a progress, like a corkscrew on the way up, because the new re-centralized version is often better. Example, you have banks, which are centralized. Then you have cryptocurrency, which is decentralized. Then you have crypto exchanges, which are re-centralized. Wait a second, did we just end up in the same place? Well, actually, no, because there's some progress. You can withdraw all your funds out of a crypto exchange. The founders are actually paying attention to their customers. They can have relationships between them, where now we have international remittances that are basically solved because of crypto, and on and on. All the ways in which crypto exchanges are better than banks, there's quite a lot of them, but they're also re-centralized, right? So in my view, the answer shouldn't just be a process answer, like how do we stay more decentralized? the answer should be a substance answer, like what are we actually trying to accomplish, right? What's the threat model, for example? If the model is, for example, I tell this to Bitcoin maximalists who will sometimes say, Bitcoin's a currency of enemies, don't trust anybody. And I'm like, there's a different way of putting it, which is Bitcoin and cryptocurrency more generally gives you a choice of who to trust. To live with zero trust, you can't do that in this world. Like as Steve Jobs said, you depend on somebody else to make your table and make sure your water is potable and make sure the power is on. Like no one human can do all the things that humans do. You have to have trust. And trust means you have to have some degree of centralization in something. You can't have everything solo and done by yourself, but you can have a choice of who to trust. And so I think that in a sense, centralization is the natural state of things. Decentralization is when you ring the fire alarm because the current system is breaking and you get the heck out of the building and everybody runs in 50 directions outside the building. And then you have the point where you re-centralize and you're like, okay, count all the heads. Okay, no one's dead. Great. We got out before the building burned. And then you rebuild the building, right? And my view is like the Western society is that burning building. Lots of people are flocking out of it. There's aspects of Chinese society also where it's not burning in quite the same way. It's definitely getting, more controlling, and people are also flooding out of it. But the goal isn't for them to just all be atomized individuals forever. They need to go and restructure things, and they're going to have to figure out new leaders and new structures.
So in the context of network states and pop-up cities that we're doing here is we're decentralizing now by having multiple events across the world. But then within the community itself, is there a process that we can go through that will mimic the same, what you described earlier?
Yeah, I think it's as simple as Veronica. So, okay, I don't know exactly the leadership structure, but so you're decentralized around the world. That's great. You're then centralized by coming in one place at the same time, right? And Veronica and the ZuVillage Georgia team organized everything. And so, if they found something, everybody knows that they did a good job as leaders and they put together a nice thing. It's actually like a huge pain. I mean, you if you've done it, you know what I mean. But like organizing a conference and getting all these people to come and making sure, that the audio video works and there's there's a lot of thankless work associated with something like that, right? And so that person or people who can put that together, those are natural leaders. And so it is good to have them doing more things, but that doesn't mean that others can't also step up and be natural leaders. They can, they just lead their own communities. That's the entire startup mentality, right? And then people will try to lead and they'll be like do an okay job, and some will do an amazing job and some will fail and whatnot, and that's fine. And it's all just to opt in as to who follows them. Like a leader is legitimated by who decides to follow them.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Hi, Balaji. This is Kathy from Fora. You're actually an investor in a startup, and we met at the Amsterdam conference. But
oh, great.
I have applying what you're saying about the corkscrew. We kind of go in these cycles around centralization and decentralization. One of the things that I think is really compelling about the network state concept about having non-contiguous territory is somewhat, I think, counter to the fact that it seems to be that, I was actually wanting to ask your opinion on this. Do you think that one of the first breakout sort of societies or, communities to demonstrate that will actually be very much bounded within a contiguous territory, right? Like plant a flag, draw a line around it. This is where all our community lives together.
Stay tuned because I've got something like right after this conference, I'm going to post something. So stay tuned. But the answer is, I think what happens is you hit saturation, the theory of bottlenecks in like, process chemistry, right? Or if you've even just saying anything in business, after you solve the biggest problem, something else becomes the biggest problem, right? So when you're doing, when you have a lot of theory and you have a lot of people online, a lot of energy, well, the bottleneck is, okay, where's the physical stuff, right? Then you have a lot of physical experiments and things. And it's like, okay, can we make some sense out of this? Where's the theory? And you go kind of back and forth. There's always a different bottleneck in the system. And I think right now, a few years ago, I wouldn't have said this, but I'd say right now, we just need as many physical experiments as possible. And I think insofar as I have made a contribution with the network state, it was, okay, here is a maybe ambitious, certainly ambitious path to sovereignty from nothing, right? Build a community online, crowdfund enough territory, gain enough cryptocurrency, prove all of that on chain over time, and eventually negotiate sovereignty, right? Like over a multi-year, maybe multi-decade period, right? That path, I don't think had been clearly articulated like that before. People had said things like, oh, Facebook has a lot of people, it's like as big as a country and so on, but that was just pure numbers. It didn't include, okay, here's the real estate and here's how you have to prove it and whatever. There's 500 details associated with that, right? Whether we can achieve that or not is TBD, but at least it sets out like a roadmap for it. However, I think the bottleneck right now is just more and more and more physical. So we should go from 3 that I think are good, like ZuZulu, and actually now, you know what? There's ZuVillage Georgia, so there's 4 that I think are good. Great job, guys. Okay, so there was ZuZulu Montenegro. There's Vitalia. There's Edge Esmeralda, and now there's ZuVillage Georgia. And there's probably the one that is going to happen in Chiang Mai will be good. And so that's great. You take the map of the world and you start lighting it up. We've got Latin America, we've got Eastern Europe, we've got Georgia, we've got Southeast Asia, bing, 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 bing. And then we go from 3 to 5 to as many as there are cryptocurrencies. And then that's just the next step. Just let's do 100 pop-ups. That's a very simple, everybody here, if you, I know there's a lot of talk about, oh, how do we protocolize and make a Hanseatic League and so on and so forth. First, make the individual point on the map. You should do it yourself. No one else will do it. You will do it yourself, right? And if you do it yourself and you have a group conference and so on, you just added a node to that potential future Hanseatic League. That would be how I think about it.
So it's kind of like a further off question then about whether or not it's going to be like fully contiguous as a starting point. Or anyway,
I think what I think will happen is, my view is, people like hubs exist for a reason because people like them. They're making things convenient, and decentralization is a cost, and you take on that cost if the benefits exceed the cost, usually because you're under attack in some way, right? Now, the biggest win of the network state is that real estate is a huge pain. What I mean by that is, like, the agility of the cloud is something we kind of take for granted. For example, when you've got a tech company, you can pivot, right? You can basically be like, okay, I'm going to hit different keys on the keyboard, and now my website is something totally different. And the earlier you are, the more, like you can literally have a completely different website, looks totally different code, different login. When you've got physical property, you are stuck to a much, much, much greater degree, right? Like, you basically can't change the weather. You often can't change your neighbors. You often can't change the laws. And it's often hard to sell, and you can't really change the market because that's like up and down in its own way. You often can't, if you've got long-term tenants, you might not even be able to easily change that. Lots of things, when you're on the land, you're locked to the land, right? And so what's cool about the network state concept is decentralization in the cloud starts to provide some of the agility of the cloud to these otherwise completely landlocked things. Because now, if you have a community and you're hemmed in and the neighbors are being completely irrational, you can tell them, okay, we're just going to expand the node that's in Georgia rather than the one that's in Montenegro, for example. And you can tell them that, and suddenly they're like, oh my God, you've got another buyer or another seller, another vendor. That's unheard of in real estate, right? That you can knit these things together around the world and get leverage out of that, right? So that is a big win of decentralization in the context. It's a very concrete thing, right? Decentralization gives you economic leverage that is extremely unusual for traditional real estate operation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you're allowed to vote with your feet, but ideally over.
Yes, vote with your feet, but crucially, it's like, it's in a way that it's as big a deal for real estate as I would say email is for communication. It's because the same community could expand in one location, but they could choose to expand in another location anywhere else in the world. That connection between those nodes has not been there before, in my view. That's what I think is novel, one piece of it. Anyway, go ahead.
That's great. I think you answered the
All right, thanks.
the announcements.
Hi, Balaji. This is Andries.
Hello. How are you? I'm just making some quick notes. Go ahead.
No worries. I've worked with Prospera, and I'm kind of involved there in a way. The question I have, and I spoke with Gabe Delgado. I think you've met him.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yesterday over the phone, and we think that the biggest bottleneck for these new special jurisdictions like Prospera, the very advanced ones, is the legislative constraints. Basically, in most countries, there are constitutional articles that prevent anything as advanced as this. And I had sent an email to Patri a couple of weeks ago, asking him whether what he's interested in investing in, what Pronomos is interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And then he told me that you're only focusing on L1 projects. And
Who, I'm only focused on L1 projects?
no,
or he is?
Yeah, but you're also in Pronomos, right?
Yeah, I'm an investor in Pronomos, yes. He's only focusing on L1 projects.
Oh, okay.
Is that, are you saying, wait, hold on. Who is only focusing on L1? Are you saying Patri said I'm only focusing on L1? No.
No, I thought Patri said that Pronomos is focusing only on L1, which includes you.
Maybe. I don't know. I don't know if that's true.
Okay.
It could be.
Okay, so you're not actively. Okay, but anyway.
No, I'm an investor in 1,000+ things, right? So I don't monitor every single. I like Patri. I just haven't talked to him about the specific thing in the last, I don't know, few months or something.
Yeah. Okay. So I have two questions, and the first is, do you agree that with my view, and which Gabe also shared, that the legislative constraints are the biggest bottleneck, and do you, and because I'm now working on a project to attack exactly that problem in multiple countries. Do you think that, is there any project that you are aware of focusing on that specifically that you have a lot of confidence in? And yeah, and the third question I'll ask afterwards.
Yeah, so it depends on what you're trying to do. I love Prospera. I'm an early investor in Prospera. I love Mini Circle. I love the fact that they have basically poked all the way through to the future to get a biomedical special innovation zone on an island that led to gene therapy that Jeff Bezos saw and liked, right? That's awesome, right? That's just like, you know, a pilot that goes all the way through to scenario end, right? It's exactly what we wanted, just to rip a hole in the future and to show it's possible. It's like a wormhole that jumps you forward 10 or 20 years. With that said, I think that for a lot of things, you don't actually need to change the law. Many things, right? And also the law, there's like local law, there's state law, there's like federal or national law, and there's international law, you know? And the bigger the law you're trying to change, the more energy you need to try to change it. You know, some sort of like nuclear power is one of the things where there's a huge number of regulations in place. It's one of the heavier things to be able to change. But if, for example, you incorporated a town in America or something like that, and there's a mechanism for doing that, you just got land in the middle of nowhere and managed to incorporate a town, well, then you usually have authority over how the roads are set up or what have you. You don't, you know, you can just write the laws. You don't need to change the laws necessarily. It basically just depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to advance high tech, right? absolutely. And I've written a lot about how the regulatory state is holding it back. Even then, what you can do often is you can, especially with AI, it makes it easier. You know what model legislation is?
Yep.
Yeah. You can write, many people gesture vaguely and they're like, oh, we need to have better regulations for this, that, or the other. And they've never thought to, because it is effort, actually look at the legal code in that jurisdiction and propose the red line. Like, this is what the law is, this is what should be deleted, and this is what should be added. Right? And thought concretely about that. Like, what is their concrete ask? They just complain about when others do it. In its own way, I understand. It's a lot like, it's the inverse of a lot of journalists complaining when engineers go and build and ship something. The journalists are very vague about what they'd rather do instead. They don't usually propose an alternative thing, and they certainly aren't coding themselves. They just dislike lots of stuff that engineers do. And engineers, founders, tech people dislike a lot of the stuff legislators do, but often we don't put in the effort to write model legislation. Now, you might say, well, why don't we do that? Because you can write the model legislation, but how do you have the power to actually implement it? And it turns out that writing the model legislation and then posting it online and getting a bunch, if you do a really good job on it and it's a good proposal, and posting it online and getting it to the attention of the right people, there's a small enough number of people doing that you actually get into the discussion more easily than you might think. I'm not saying it's as easy as pushing code to a website, but in most areas, they're arcane enough that, like, there's 1,000, 10,000 as many people writing about nuclear power as coming up with the red line of exactly what the Alara edits or whatever should be, right? And then the next step is you actually find a small enough jurisdiction that's willing to go and buck the consensus. All of this is becoming easier in 2024 with social media, with the breakdown of Washington, D.C.'s power, emergence of the multipolar world. You actually have many jurisdictions that want to compete for talent, that want to compete for investment, and so on and so forth. And so you don't necessarily have to found the jurisdiction completely from scratch. You can go with, here is the red line edit, and here's the group of entrepreneurs that will come and do this. Can we go and build something in your region? Anyway, those are a few things there. The last thing I would just say, though, is lots of things are blocked not by legality, but by community. If you just had 1,000 people in person that all are agreeing, on that they're all, let's say, interested in Ethereum, you'd probably have Ethereum development move a lot faster. That itself is worth doing. It's not necessarily changed the law.
Yeah. And in connection with that, I had a third question, actually, and that is how interested are you personally in investing in projects that bring network effects to these new zones? I sent you an email about 2 weeks ago about it, but I understand if you don't have a lot of time to read it.
Oh, no. Yeah, just ping me, just reply back in the email or something. I just get, like, I don't know how many messages a day, but I get a lot of messages a day. So I just answer as many emails as I can, and then I just it's like I can't read all my notifications, and so I've got like a few folks who do read over the inbox for the really important stuff, but it is a very high volume inbox. So
I'll send you a little follow-up.
Okay, great. And I think I've got time for maybe one more question, and I gotta jump.
Balaji, I think that the last point here that you came, like, that what's the line and what's, like, we can do without changing, like, the law, but just doing things ourselves, gets to a point of interest of mine, that is, where do you think that the facts will lead to drawing the line of how far do we get to go before some of the experiments are seen more of a problem than in a lie, given that given in status quo, whoever holds power would likely prefer to keep holding to it, right? And not all power will migrate, although finance here can be a bridge of some of that migration. Not all power will migrate, and some of that power will try to retain it. what is the line that you imagine that's like the point where network states go either through scale or through ideology or through decentralization? What would be a likely step that you'd say, maybe don't take that step? Maybe don't do that thing if you don't want to get problem with real nation states or real
Oh, I mean, there's tons of things, right? My view is I would stay on the side of high tech. And like life extension, drones, brain machine interface. I think a rough rule of thumb, and this is why I care about it, is if it's venture backable, it's probably something that you can do a network state thing around, right? Like, because what that does is it gives a large enough financial, legal, political, community, technological cheering section behind something, right? Whereas there's like a bunch of other things that will just trigger the establishment that you just don't want to do, in my view. Whereas the tech stuff, they're anti any kind of change. It's true, but it's a little bit harder to demonize like a new self-driving car city, for example.
Yeah. Okay. So like, in thinking of terms of legal, like having our own like internal private police that is like holding monopoly of violence over a certain region, you don't see that as a possibility of escalation that would be a red line, for example.
So this is, I mean, it totally depends on the jurisdiction, right? In like the blue parts of America, where they've basically abolished the police and people are like burning cars on the streets of San Francisco, and they don't give out ticket. Like you could see crime is down because they just aren't give out any tickets, and the government is feeding drugs to addicts and handing out syringes and all this kind of stuff or whatever, right? Then you've got like just this extremely unusual situation, that is actually now becoming usual because it's being exported to lots of other, cities in blue regions. And at that point, all of your choices are not great because you're dealing with an evil government. Like, everybody here is in a post-Soviet country, right? You know what an evil government is. An evil government is one where the party genuinely doesn't care about the people. The party is just out there to rob the money. And so in places like that, where the police have been abolished, what you find when you dig into it is the money for the police have been reallocated to NGOs and so on, and they're paying bureaucrats, or like, the $100 billion California train, where you can see there's only 1,600 feet of track that's being laid. Where the billions of dollars go, it basically went to like legal graft, right? In a situation like that, where you're dealing with like a corrupt and evil government, your choices aren't great because they're either A, just submit to it, in which case your situation gets worse and worse and worse, and you're depoliced, and women are attacked on the street, assaulted on the street, Asians are murdered in broad daylight in San Francisco, windows are smashed, robbed, all this kind of stuff. B, you have to actually spend a fair amount of money to pick up stakes and leave and exit, which a lot of people do. Or C, you have to figure out some plan for turnaround that means a new security service. And that would mean, okay, here's my neighborhood, and we set it up. I mean, like Costco, for example, at the level of a building, does have membership to enter, right? Every office, if you have an office in San Francisco, you have a key card to enter. And we accept that that's legitimate at the level of a single building or residence. And we also accept it's legitimate for a quote gated community to exist, where there's a bunch of houses that are all owned by the same property developer that's leased them out. They've got a gate to come in and out, right? And the question is how big that gated community can be and how large that private security or whatever can be there. Now, that's actually an extremely non-ideal way of living, because ideally what you want is a functional state that doesn't hate the people and isn't stealing all the money and so on and so forth. But when you have something like the Soviet Union or like South Africa or something like that, where you have a dysfunctional state, then you have to have a second level of police because the first level is dysfunctional. It's not like, oh my God, yeah, I want to have private police for the sake of it. It's because literally the police don't protect women walking down the street. They're just cashing a check, and they're time servers. They're like corrupt cops, unfortunately. So it's a difficult situation, but let me pause there.